Yeah, thank you so much, Ben. So Robbie and I are going to talk about our work extracting land records from a data set of Kenyan government publications called the Kenya Gazette. So we're going to start off with a little bit of context for where this project came from, move on to talking about our data set, which are PDFs of government notices required by transparency laws, and in particular talking about what kind of land information exists in these records. And then we're going to go through our pipeline and output, really formulating this around the key question of our project, which was to what extent can we get a structured data set from these PDFs? So just to give a little bit of context for the origins of this project, our project is meant to provide data tools to support folks doing long haul work around land ownership, and land stewardship in Kenya. And we really want to ground our presentation in a sliver of context for this work, which the originators and leaders of this project shared with us when we started. So when we're talking about the ownership and use of land in Kenya, we're talking about a system that is inextricably linked with colonization. So really briefly, throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, the British colonial power appropriated massive amounts of land, re-granted it to settlers, and devastated native land systems, many of which did not involve land ownership in the European sense. And while pre-colonial agricultural technologies generally manage natural resources in regenerative and sustainable ways, British single crop plantations and extractive industries did not. And this shaped what was really the first wave of land scarcity in the region's history. So it's telling that the leading revolutionary militant group of the independence struggle was called the Land and Freedom Army, and really shows that land and the resources it provides for life were essential to both colonization and the resistance to it. So I'm going to go ahead and read this quote from Field Marshal Mutoni, who in the 1950s was a high-ranking officer in the Land and Freedom Army, because she describes much better than I can the ways that post-colonial land transfers went to a very small number of people and families, some settlers and some native Kenyans who had collaborated closely with the colonial government. So she says in 2011, we wanted our land and we wanted our freedom, but I have nothing to be proud of today, not with Black people of Kenyan origin still living along roadsides as squatters and villagers, not to mention the thousands of unsettled, internally displaced persons. So really heavy stuff. Today, folks in Kenya are working under conditions of land theft and corruption, inequities in land ownership, and real scarcity of the land and resources that are required for life. So on the left here is an article that CfA journalists helped to research this year. There was a court case, they helped to make possible a court case to investigate a land deal that happened in 1996, in which a few land ministry officials allocated a tract of government trust land to a private shell corporation, which then sold that land back to the government trust. This deal lost the Social Security Fund, really the core of the Kenyan social safety net, millions of dollars, or of Kenyan shillings. So many reports and articles and sectors of advocacy that show that this is not an isolated incident, that corruption facilitated through the lands ministry is systemic. So when we talk about land, we're talking about an emotive, deep-rooted, and high-stakes topic that a lot of people really, really care about. So the origins of this project come from a network of folks who are trying to deal with the specific issue that there are not a lot of accessible, usable, and aggregated data sources on land use and ownership in Kenya. So to make more concrete how information can actually be useful to those doing long-term work, so Code for Africa and the World Resources Institute, which we'll be referring to as CfA and WRI respectively, they really conceptualize this project and have two specific strategies behind expanding the land data that is available. So CfA is interested in more land data because they facilitate a network of investigative and data journalists, including many based in Kenya, and they want to support these journalists and other groups to investigate illegal and unjust land deals. So aggregated data can reveal insights and patterns to help facilitate those investigations. And given powerful evidence from these investigations, there are legal pathways to returning land and to returning wealth gained through unjust and illegal land deals. WRIs and country folks, on the other hand, work with corporate, government, and individual landowners to implement sustainable land practices. And more data on who these landowners are helps them figure out whom to try to influence. It's hard to influence people if you don't know who they are. So our data set, which Robbie is going to talk a lot more about, represents a very small sliver, or relatively small sliver, of information about Kenya's land, about who owns or leases it, and about how it's used, which CfA and WRI believe can help to fill some of the gaps that currently exist. It comes from the fact that transparency laws require that the government issue certain notices to the public, and that these sometimes mention land ownership information. However, these data are currently buried in thousands of pages of PDFs, and so our project goal is to extract and structure that information so that it can be merged with other databases.
Hey everyone, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our data set, which, as Thea mentioned, is called the Kenya Gazettes. So the Kenya Gazette is not an ordinary newspaper. It's the Kenyan government publishes it as a register. I think the closest analogy in the United States would be something like the Federal Register. So I'm going to show you a sample table of contents of the Kenya Gazette here on the left. Just a few examples of things you might find in the Kenyan Gazette would be things like a list of newly elected officials, or a list of companies licensed to practice construction, or a list of new trademarks that companies have acquired recently. And like Thea mentioned, what we focused on is land-related information in these gazettes. So the main act that we focused on, a transparency act that forces things to be put in the gazettes, is called the Land Registration Act, which deals with lost title deeds. And so what happens is if you ever lose your title deed before you can get a new one issued, you have to have several Gazette notices published saying this is about to happen to ensure there's no fraud. So this is not a direct source of information on who owns every piece of land in Kenya. It's a very indirect source, but there are a very high number of these notices published in a lot of Kenya Gazettes, so you actually get a pretty interesting picture of land ownership in Kenya just through these lost title deed notifications. And we would have loved to have time to focus on other acts, like say the Land Act that deals with allocation of public land, but we didn't have time in our project to do that research, and we're hoping it can be done in the future. So on the right here is a sample page of a Gazette. I'm going to draw my mouse here around one little block of text, which I'm going to refer to later as a chunk or a notice or a segment. Each of these notices stand on their own, so we want to look at them in isolation. So if we zoom in on just this one segment, we'll see there's a lot of information we might want to grab just from this one Land Registration Act notice. So we can look at the name of a company, Miti Through Company Limited, their address, a piece of land they own and its location, and also its size. And there's a lot of information here we want to take from this unstructured paragraph form and put into a structured data set. So before I talk about how we did that, I just want to familiarize everyone in the audience with some of the other tools that are out there to look at these Kenya Gazettes. So if you wanted to know more about Miti Through Company Limited, how could you do that? Well, all these gazettes are scanned and they're available online. So we'd like to thank our partners for making that happen. And on a website called Connected Africa, you can do a keyword search on Miti Through Company and see what gazettes they might appear in. And it's actually quite a powerful tool. You'll see 2 gazettes, each with several pages with lots of detailed land information on Miti Through Company Limited. There are a couple shortcomings that we hope to make better with our project, and I'm going to draw your attention to them now. The first is, if you see on the bottom left, this website already has an entity recognition tool, but it doesn't do a perfect job. You'll see that it picks up Miti Through Company Limited. It thinks its full name has a whereas at the beginning, which we know isn't right. And as a result, we're only seeing 2 gazettes where this company appears, when really we know from our own research there are 6. So there's just some missing information as a result of some computer bugs. The second piece of this that we hope to improve upon is that we want to make this information interact with itself in a networked sense. So imagine you wanted to find out more about Miti Through Company Limited. You saw they had an address in Nairobi, and you wanted to say, okay, what company shares that address? You could then do a keyword search on the address and find several companies. If you then wanted to find further information, say, what do those companies at that shared address, what land do they own? You'd again have to do more and more keyword searches, to the point where if you're trying to build a web or a network, you'd have a very long day just continually doing keyword searches. So we wanted to make that process faster and more efficient to discover more. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about our pipeline and our output, and hopefully discuss how we improve these processes. So to give you an extremely broad overview of what our process does from start to finish, we start with these raw PDFs that are published online on websites like Connected Africa, and we want to take the PDF through a chain of work, which gets it all the way down to a structured data set where we have entities, like say a person or an address or a company, and then also relationships between them, like say a certain company owns a certain piece of land. So the first piece of that, as we have on the left here, is converting a PDF just to a raw text form that can be used by natural language programs. And the way we do that is we have, again, on the right here is an image of a Gazette. We're going to feed this image of this PDF to a program called Read API for Microsoft Cognitive Services. And Read API doesn't give us the text in its perfect form. It actually gives us a set of bounding boxes with text associated. So then with our own scripts, we have to go in and put these bounding boxes in order. And once we've done that, we can get raw text. So once we have this raw text, as I mentioned earlier, each of these texts has self-isolating, self-standing segments that we want to evaluate on their own. So we use regular expressions to isolate each of these segments so we can look at them on their own and analyze them on their own. And from there, I'll let T tell you a bit more about our entity extraction.
Once we have each of the texts segmented into their individual notice parts, there are certain entities that we're interested in extracting. There are a total of 21 entities that we want to extract, but the default spacey model, which is the tool that we used, has only 10 entities that it extracts. So we continued and trained a new spacey model, and the output, what you see is on the right-hand side. All the entities that are highlighted in gray have been extracted by the modified model. And as you can see, it does a great job of identifying, let's say, specifically land size or even deed status if it has been lost or reissued, which is really great for our work. But even this model is not 100% accurate. I'll draw your attention to the very last line, which has land register. It identifies it as a person, which is absolutely, of course, not. We know that's not a person. So even if it has some shortcomings, this modified model does a really good job of extracting a lot of the 21 entities that we're interested in. And it gives us a very useful output for the next stage, which is building relationships between these entities. When we talk about building relationships, here is a potential visualization of that relationship. This visualization was made from a certain subset, and the purple dots indicate here persons, while the blue dots indicate land, and the size of the blue dot indicates how big that land is. So from this type of visualization, one can, for example, see, is there one individual that has a lot of land around them? Or is there one land that's being contested by a lot of people? Or is there even one land throughout history has been shredded to pieces? Maybe it started out being big, but the amount keeps changing from time to time. These are insights then that one can draw from our new output that were not possible using the existing tools mentioned earlier. Once we did this type of visualization, we noticed a concentration in one area and we zoomed into it, which is where we found Mutithuru Company Limited, which apparently owns 21 different properties, which means it has been reissued 21 different land deeds throughout time between 2008 2019. This raised an alarm for us because that seemed to be an outlier. But to clarify, maybe in the local context, maybe owning 21 lands or 21 properties is not an outlier. Or maybe even this company might own a lot more land, but just hasn't had the title deeds be reissued. All of these are questions that we can't answer because we don't have the local context, but we believe this type of output is very crucial for our partners on the ground to identify where should I focus my time? What are certain things that stand out to me that I want to poke deeper, which wouldn't have been possible, as Robbie mentioned earlier, without having to dig through the website for a long time. And we've made that process a lot easier now. But even with all of this really insightful output, there are certain limitations and future directions that we recommend. We found Mutithuru Company Limited, after a short exploratory data analysis or a short search in our output, there's definitely more insights in the output that one can explore further. So we recommend exploring this data set going forward. Also, in the Microsoft Cognitive Services that was mentioned earlier, we struggled a little bit to work with tables and charts that require a different system. So we recommend people taking this further could also improve on that. The third thing that can be improved is the named entity recognition tool, the spacey tool that I mentioned earlier. As you've seen, it wrongly identifies certain entities as person, even when they're not people. So that can definitely be improved. Also, there are more things. This can be expanded to more years, more publication, and even in other countries. And finally, if it is integrated into the current website that we showed you earlier, we hope it will make the website even better. With all of these said, having seen this entire pipeline, now we can show you a few of the takeaways that we have. We were very impressed by how much insight is actually hidden in these gazettes once we're able to convert that information into an aggregated and structured data. So our output one helps find relationships across gazettes. For example, if there was the one company that has purchased a land in 2012 and in 2018, In the current system, that information exists in 2 different places. But in our case, you can actually find that in one place. So one can find that types of relationships easily. 2, one can also use their favorite visualization tools to visualize relational patterns. We used a certain tool to show you the visualization in the previous slide, but one can also use their own method to get a visual sense and say, okay, where should I start to poke deeper? What are certain things that raise question for me? And last but not least, after this has been integrated into the website, it will definitely help improve the keyword search, which we hope will be what our partners take this further. With all of that said, we're hoping all of this output will address our partners' needs that was mentioned in the very beginning, which is 1, help investigate land-related corruption, and also help advocate for a more sustainable use of land. With all of that said, we want to say thank you to our partners who have been very helpful in this process, Code for Africa and World Resource Institute. And also we want to say thank you to a few stakeholders and parties that have been absolutely integral to this process. With all of that said, thank you for your attention, and we would welcome any question that you have.